Next up, we have a discussion panel, so slightly different than what we've had for the first two sessions. This is a discussion panel between myself, along with Professors John Baines and Alan Lloyd, and both of whom were present when the Wellcome Collection was dispersed and was received by different institutions. So Professor John Baines is the Professor Emeritus in the University of Oxford. He taught formerly at the University of Durham. John has also held visiting appointments in the departments of Egyptology, Anthropology, Art History and Archaeology, as well as Near Eastern Studies at universities in Africa, Asia, Europe and North America. Throughout his career, he has sought to integrate the study of ancient Egypt into the wider discourse of the humanities and social sciences. Alan Lloyd is also a Professor Emeritus at Swansea University. He was the chairman of the Egypt Exploration Society from 1994 to 2007, and the vice president until his election as the president at the AGM in 2011. He retired in 2006 from his post as Professor of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Swansea. Alan has also participated in EES excavations at North Saqqara in 1972 to 73, and with the Society's Saqqara Epigraphic Survey, which began in 1976 on the series of Old Kingdom tombs in the Tedi Pyramid Complex. Professor Lloyd is an authority on the writings of the historian Herodotus, and also has an extensive publication record dealing with various topics in ancient Egypt. So as mentioned, both Alan and John were present when the dispersal took place of the Wellcome Collection 50 years ago. And so it's nice to have their input into their experience as to what actually happened. So we'll start off with John. John, how did you get involved with the selecting of the objects?
Well, I went to Durham. I took up a job as a lecturer in Durham in 1970. And towards the end of that academic year, I was told that there was this dispersal happening and asked to go and look at the objects and participate in it. I was not on the staff of the museum in Durham, which at that point was called the Gulbenkian Museum, is now called the Oriental Museum, but I did use it in teaching. It was part of the same physical complex as the department that I was in, which was called Oriental Studies. And so I went to London to look at what we might see, and this was done in cooperation with John Ruffell of the University of Birmingham, sorry, the Birmingham City Museum. He was the Egyptological curator there. And so he, unlike me, was an actual museum curator. We spent a couple of days together looking at the material, but we could only look at it very briefly and quickly because, as has already been said about Swansea an hour ago, there are about 4,000 objects. That's an estimate which you can also hear from Rachel Barclay later this afternoon. So we were shown groups of objects which had been pre-selected by David Dixon, who was the Wellcome curator, who had moved in the 1960s from the Wellcome Museum to UCL, together with the Egyptian objects, which were in storage in basements at UCL. Now, my memory of this is not great because it's a long time ago, but John Ruffell and I would look at groups of objects together, and we would basically say to each other, I'll take this lot and you have that lot, and we didn't really have any guidelines on how to do this. Well, John Ruffell, being a curator in Birmingham, he was familiar with the collections there. He could say, well, we don't have such and such, so it'd be useful to acquire this and that. But we were given objects which had been taken out of their cases, their packing cases, in addition to which there must have been lots of other objects in packing cases. And so what we were doing was sampling material. And as I think probably anyone who's worked with the Wellcome material will know, there were a lot of fakes in the collections. I was not a museum curator, but I had spent time using museum collections and also working on excavations. So I did know something about this. And I remember at one point, I said to John, well, there's this group here, they're all fakes. And he said, well, this group here is fakes too. So I'll take those, you take those. And it was done as casually as that. Essentially, there was no documentation attached to the material. And we've seen in Ruth Horry's talk the photographs of large cabinets full of cards and things like that, but nothing of that sort was there with us. So we simply looked at the material and split it up as it suited us. And David Dixon had pre-selected cases for us, but on what criteria, I don't know. We were aware that other collections in Liverpool and Swansea were also getting material, but that must have happened at a different time. And although the documentation says that this was done in May 1971, my memory was that it was in July, but I could be wrong. It's a long time ago.
Yes,
that's a sort of brief summary of what we were doing.
Well, that's really useful. And in terms of, you said things that was laid out and others were in boxes. Were you told that you were allowed to take so many objects or so many boxes, or was it a case of really going through this and deciding, well, that looks like this is going to be enough for Durham and so on?
I don't think we could go into that much detail because it did take no more than 2 days, if I remember right. You can't look at 4,000 objects in 2 days. So this is trying to reconstruct my memory. I think that we must have been given samples of materials from sample boxes, but we didn't have a choice of boxes ourselves. So I would suppose that the boxes had been divided up simply perhaps by number or by some knowledge of what was in them. And then approximately it was divided into 4 to the 4 main recipients. And obviously this has a back history at Durham. In other words, before I was ever involved, Durham, probably UCL wrote to Durham and said, would you be interested in having some of this material? And Durham said yes, but that was actually before, possibly before I arrived in Durham. I arrived in October 1970, and I think the first negotiations about this dispersal were earlier in 1970. And the curators in the Durham Museum were not Egyptologists. There was one person specializing in Chinese material and another who was an Indian specialist. So my second predecessor had actually installed the museum, but by the time I arrived in Durham, there was much more teaching and other work. And so I wasn't expected to do more than use the museum collection in teaching, not to curate it. Anyway, let me not hog the conversation.
So, Alan, in terms of your experience, although you weren't directly involved in selecting the objects, you certainly seen them arrive at Swansea College, as it was then, back in September 1971. What is your experience or memory of the event?
I was certainly not involved in the process that John has just described. The Swansea people involved in that were Doctor, as he was then, Dr. Gwyn Griffiths, and his wife, Kate Bosser Griffiths. And my recollection is that David Dixon was very much involved, being a Welshman, and I suspect that he was very keen to see great chunks of this material come to Swansea. I also have a memory that Harry Smith, who was at UCL, was involved, but exactly how much he did, I don't know. Anyway, once the decision had been made that material should come to Swansea, a rather large number of tea chests full of Egyptian antiquities and fakes was put onto a furniture van and brought down to Swansea. And we were very fortunate in that the professor of chemistry was very keen on this, and he made available to us a very large laboratory in the chemistry department, which meant that there was a context, first of all, where the tea chests could be deposited, and secondly, where they could be opened and assessed. And it was at that point that I was brought into the operation, though the initial work on the assessment was done by Kate Bossa-Griffiths. That was an interesting experience. I was very occasionally asked for my opinion, but when I pointed out that although we'd been lucky in getting a lot of genuine Egyptian antiquities, like everybody else involved in this distribution process, we had a fair sprinkling of fakes. And Kate tended to take the view that any suggestion that any of these objects was a fake was a personal slight on her. But we managed. And eventually they were all assessed. I can't say exactly what the next stage in the operation was, because Kate tended to keep me out of the way. Her husband was rather more tractable than I was, and indeed am. But eventually, John Gould and I, Professor John Gould and I, came very strongly to the view that the collection could provide the basis of a teaching collection. And we acquired a room in the Department of Classics, and eventually 2 rooms in which material that could be used for teaching purposes was deposited. And that was very successful. In some of the comments that I've seen online, there seems to be a suggestion that we were somehow set against using the material as a teaching collection, but that is simply not the case to begin with. There was the enormous process of deciding what you had and how you were going to do it. And of course, we all had other commitments to meet as well. The next phase, of course, was the next major phase, I should say, was the involvement of the late Sybil Crouch, who was the head of the Taliesin building. And she was very forward-looking in this and indeed many other contexts. And Sybil was very keen that we should use more of the collection and indeed more for display purposes and also for teaching. And of course, the welcome material was supplemented by material from other sources, such as the Royal Exeter and in private donations. And eventually, with her very strong support, we were able to get lottery funding, etc., to develop this enterprise. In 1997, we were able to appoint a curator, Carolyn Graves Brown, who is still with us, and the museum, essentially in its present incarnation, was opened in 1998 with, well, by the Viscount St. David's, not the current one, who is rather a naughty boy, but his father, who was quite a delightful man and greatly interested in what we're doing. And with the museum established in this way, we were able to make and continue to make a very considerable contribution to the outreach mission of the university. We don't simply use it for undergraduate and postgraduate work, but Carolyn has always been very keen that schools should be encouraged to come to us, and indeed other forms of outreach enterprise, really. And the whole thing, on the outreach front particularly, has been, I think, an enormous success and has done the college a very great deal of good. Of course, with Egyptology, you can hardly miss, because everyone is interested in Egyptology. An old colleague of mine once said that Egyptology is a subject for sublimated necrophiliacs, and the death dimension has always fascinated people and will continue to do so, I think. So that's a potted account of how things developed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And you'd mentioned obviously the teaching and the collection was involved in teaching aspects. And I think, John, you'd also said that was the same in Durham when you were teaching up there. Is that right?
Yes, well, in Durham, it was, there were a couple of differences. When I went to Durham, it was quite a new idea in universities which taught Egyptology that people should actually look at physical objects. But Durham has an outstanding old collection with the former Northumberland collection. It's very, very different. It's a choice collection assembled by a rich man in the 1820s, approximately. And so it has some unique objects and a lot of very fine ones. And they were already installed in the museum. In the first years I was in Durham, I taught from the displays, and then we began to use objects taken out of display so that we could look at them properly. And we used one or two welcome objects, but relatively in the first few years, the welcome material had not really been assimilated because, as I said, the curators at that time were not experts in the area, and it took a very long time for all of this to be processed. And I was in Durham for 5.5 years, and so it was actually my successors who did more with the collection than I did. There was it's a very nice building in a way that they already had, but it was very difficult to expand its display areas. This has been addressed much more recently, like in the last few years. And so you couldn't suddenly add a lot to what was on display. So in the initial years, there were just a few welcome objects which were taken out. And well, Rachel Barclay will talk about it later. So I don't want to anticipate her, but the collection, as I already implied, it came entirely or almost entirely without documentation. And so everything had to be taken out and looked at, and old numbers on it looked at and so on. And there was, over the years, contact with Wellcome as an institution, but I think there's probably still a lot to do to decide exactly what things are. And as with all old collections, was the Northumberland collection was of course very old. There tend to be some objects which can no longer be identified with what's in the catalogue and things like that. The Northumberland collection catalogue was published in, or was privately published in 1880. So it is in a quite different context. But Durham basically has just the Northumberland collection and the Wellcome material. It doesn't have a huge amount of other acquisitions, but obviously it has a few. But I think over the years it's been very important because, of course, it means that there is always material that can be worked on more, and there is a context for people to do Egyptian archaeology there in a way that there wouldn't have been otherwise. As of now, not when I was there, Egyptology is part of the archaeology department in Durham. And so there's a more direct connection in that respect. Even though I was in the same physical building, the courses I inherited were not strongly archaeological.
And now this is really going to test your memory.
Right.
Anna Garnett has asked whether you remember if the crates in the Petrie Museum were spread around the whole museum or stacked in a particular room for selection purposes.
I don't really remember that, but reading, reading also, for example, a letter of David Dixon's that was given to me, a copy of it the other day, it looks as if, it said in this letter that the material was actually in some basement store somewhere. And we didn't, as far as I remember, go to the basement store. I think the boxes must have been brought to the Petrie Museum. But I don't remember in which room of the Petrie Museum it happened. I think it was probably, well, from what I know about the layout of the museum now, my guess would be that it was in the room where people now have a lot of computers and there are some staff working there, because at that date, the museum basically didn't have any staff, so that was probably an available space. But I could be wrong. So sorry.
Yeah, I'd often wondered whether there was any photographs of the collection having been laid out onto the desks, but I guess if there was, Anna would probably know about those, or hopefully find them in the archives at the Petrie, which would be great.
Yeah, well, at the moment, at that time, I don't remember any photographs being taken, and I would be surprised because this was before smartphones and things like that. To take photographs, you'd have needed proper lighting and cameras with tripods and things like that. And I don't think we had anything of that sort. Mm. So my guess is that there simply isn't any photographic record.
And Alan, you'd mentioned earlier about the collection coming here in the 92 crates and so on. What was the buzz like around the college at the time when they came here? Was there a lot of colleagues in the department who were keen on seeing the objects that were coming out of the boxes and so on?
I wouldn't have said so, because within the department, in the strict sense, you had Gwyn Griffiths and myself who were paid up Egyptologists, but the rest were dedicated classicists, and they showed what I might describe as a polite interest, but nothing more than that. But the enthusiasm increased, I think, as the collection gradually got a higher profile. Once we'd moved into the Department of Classics and had the 2 rooms with some quite good, or sometimes very good, Egyptian material, the interest in this developed. But there was always in some quarters in the department the feeling that they didn't want the department overrun with Egyptologists. And I did my best, I think very successfully, to keep that rather negative view of things at bay. But if you have people around whose main interest is imperial Latin poetry, the chances are that they're not going to be much bothered about Old Kingdom artifacts from Egypt.
Kate did display some objects from the classical world, I think around about
Yes.
1980. Did that increase people's interest in the collection, would you say?
Yes, I think that people were aware that this was going on, and Kate, I think, was aware that it was necessary to do to engage in a little bit of politicking on that front. But the greater the profile of the collection, physically speaking, the greater the interest. And of course, once we got cracking on the development of the Egyptian collection within the context of Taliesin, it had a very considerable profile. And I remember on one occasion, I was talking to the Vice Chancellor outside the museum, and he wanted to be taken in and shown what was going on, and showed a very real and committed interest in what was going on. The realization was dawning that this was not self-indulgence, that the collection could play an extremely important part in projecting a positive image of the university as a whole, and could also be an important teaching aid. And in that sense, it's gone from strength to strength. And Kasia Szpakowska, who is now, of course, retired, was particularly keen on the use of the collection in teaching contexts. You will be well aware of this because you were probably subjected to some of that yourself. And that, I think, has been a huge success, and I very much approve of that development.
Well, thank you very much. Just one final question to both of you, really. What would you say was the impact that the collection had on both the both universities as well as the community?
Well, I let John start on that.
Well, I think in Durham it really didn't have much of an impact at first, because the museum's primary collections were, as I said, Chinese and Indian, and they were very active with donors and people like that for those collections. And again, they're very high quality bodies of material, and it was well, Durham was a very small place in those days, and really it took a number of years before the museum, I think, acquired a much larger profile. The museum also in later years spent many years trying to raise funds to enlarge the building, but without success. So I think they were quite close to succeeding, but they didn't. And so there's a limit to what you can do in premises of the size that they had. So I would say that it's had a transformative effect in Swansea, but it didn't in earlier years in Durham. Now, Rachel Barclay will be able to tell you more about later years, and so let's leave that side to her, I'd say.
And Rachel will be talking at 4 o'clock today, slightly earlier time at 4 o'clock with the change to the programme.
I think that as far as Swansea is concerned, the collection has had a very considerable impact. It's available for people to come and see it whenever the place is open, and that's an opportunity which people avail themselves of. But in particular, I would want to emphasize the role it's played in the schools. Many of the schools in Swansea have signed up for courses of a variety of different kinds, visits of a variety of different kinds, and this has spread knowledge of the collection and indeed ancient Egypt broadly within the city. And I think it's been more successful in that respect than the material that we have in the Swansea Museum. Some of that material is, of course, very interesting, but the impact has been relatively slight. And I think quite a lot of the credit for this does go to Carolyn, who has always, from the very beginnings of the collection, been very keen on the outreach dimension. So it's a real plus in the city.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. That was really fantastic to have the chat with you. And since you'd mentioned about us working with the schools and so on, you weren't here at the very beginning, Alan, but the VC has announced that as of Monday, we will be opening to the public after 18 months of being closed. So we're very happy to be open again. Anybody who may have missed that at the beginning, do please check on our website for details, which Sam will be posting into the chat.